Yeah, this is part two of how to plan your content for content marketing. Particular in this section, we're going to talk mostly about how do you go about measuring whether your content is having an impact, what kind of metrics are you going to use, what is a KPI, and what kind of tools can you use actually to complete the measurement and the tracking. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to try to provide a rationale for what kind of metrics are we going to use. And to do this, we're going to take a customer-centric approach. So we're going to start by thinking about how customers go about engaging with a brand and a firm in particular. And to do so, we're going to try to reiterate this idea of the customer journey, right? Where you basically think about your customers as basically moving through different stages from the beginning that they become aware that they have a problem and maybe also that your brand slash company exists, to the point that maybe they do some research to gather information about potential solutions to the problem that they have realized that they have, or opportunity, doesn't have to be negative, right? And this is what famously Procter and Gamble um, coined as zero moment of truth, right? And then maybe after that, you have some sort of brands or options that you're seriously considering in terms of maybe products, services, um, or solutions for your problem, right? Then after that, you make a choice, right? And by the way, to not choose might be one of the choices, obviously, right? And to punt down the road. And then finally, you make your purchase, right? And after you're making your purchase, maybe you might consider also looking at some post-purchase stages. Maybe you become loyal, ideally, right, to the brand that you have actually purchased, and or maybe even if you're not 100% loyal, you become an advocate for the brand, right? And like by maybe going online and providing positive feedback to other potential users about the brand, maybe by talking about your experiences and on and on. So if this customer journey actually maps to what we think customers do, it will be useful to set up goals that basically are going to enable us to track customers through this journey, right? So maybe at the beginning stages where you're talking about awareness and research, the kind of goals that are going to be reasonable are going to be about something like audience reach. How many people actually are seeing us as a viable option as a brand or as a company, right? Then maybe at a later stage, maybe when you're doing some research or when you're more seriously considering, you might want to look into some engagement with the brand, right? That could be something like we're going to see later, uh, maybe the number of times that you go to the website, and or maybe the number of likes for different pages within a platform, etc. And then at the later stages, especially at the purchase stage and maybe loyalty, you might want to look about your conversion of leads and maybe your capability to generate new leads, right? So there's going to be different goals that are going to basically enable you to track that customer journey. And hopefully by having multiple goals, we're going to be able to map it out and understand where we are weak, where we are strong, and how can we actually achieve the goals and ideally objectives that we set forth. Now what I'm going to try to do here is suggest that if you use this customer journey, this is going to enable us to categorize to some degree, although some of the metrics may actually uh, pinpoint at multiple stages, but I will argue that there are some metrics that are definitely better for some stages versus others, right? And I'm going to focus on three big buckets of metrics. I'm going to talk about user behavior or customer behavior in our case, because that's what we're ultimately interested in. Customer engagement, right? This is about actions. And finally, outcomes, right? So To this end, what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk you through some of these metrics, and then I'm going to try to suggest what kind of stages they're going to enable you to map more reasonably, although many of them, as you will see, or I will suggest, might actually be using multiple stages, because it's not a clear-cut stage model. At the end of the day, customers go back and forth through some of these journeys. It's mostly a model that we're used to try to understand reality, as opposed to suggesting that decision making in customers happens this linearly. May not be the case, right? Good. So what are some of the user behaviors that you're going to be able to get data on in an online setting? The first one is obvious, the number of page views, right? Especially in a website setting, this is going to be very prominent. This is usually associated with awareness, maybe consideration, but that will be more of a secondary metric, right? Also, you're going to have number of users, and here websites or some platforms are going to make a distinction between users and new users, right? So if you're talking about new users, I will argue that's a prime metric for awareness, right? Although, like I said, users may also be used for consideration, but that will be more of a secondary. What else? Time spent on page, right? This is going to be typically used when you're looking at consideration, or maybe the early stages of the decision, but I would say mostly for consideration. This might also be indicative, for example, if you're interested in determining content quality, the idea being the longer customer spends in a page, the better the quality of the content, because that's why they're staying there, right? So there might be different aspects you might be able to monitor within each of these stages depending on the metric, right? Bounce rate, which is basically to a large degree a metric of how relevant the information provided is for what task the customer is trying to achieve at the time. So this might be something that it's related to consideration, maybe awareness, but it's more of a quality of the content that you are using relative to where those leads have been generated, if we're honest, right? Number of pages per session, again, this is going to capture basically how interested the customer is given what they see, right? If they go through a lot of the information in your website, it is possible that means that they are engaged. It also is possible that the structure is poor, and because of that, it takes them a lot of pages to actually find what they want. So the number of pages per session, especially if it's in a unique visit, may not be the best indicator, although it could be indicative of potential issues as well. And where that traffic was generated from. I'll show you more of this later, right? So where are we getting the visitors that we're actually getting from? Okay, good. Other type of metrics, likes, right, or thumbs up, right? And these are going to be in the consideration or decision stage, obviously, more than awareness, right? So, you know, the cost associated with a like is low online for the most part, although there are some platforms that require you to sign in before you can like. In that case, maybe there is a cost associated with like. So it's not a high threshold that you require to click on a like. It's not like customers run out of likes, although I guess there might be some platform where that's the case, but it's not typical, right? So usually for these two stages of your journey, likes will be a good metric. Shares can also be an indication for decision and consideration, although more decision than it will be for consideration. And the obvious metric for shares will be for advocacy, right? So if people are sharing your content, it's because they're liking your content probably, but also because they're trying to tell other people about it. So they're advocating for your brand, typically, right? Comments, this is typical engagement metric. Many platforms, customers are encouraged to actually provide feedback, right? So comments could be an indication in multiple stages. It's not as clear cut, right? Mentions, I will argue advocacy and maybe decision, and repostings. mentions, repostings, and shares are very similar, just slightly different platforms, and those will gear towards the, let's say, post-purchase stage. Okay. And then finally, in terms of outcomes, the generic term for this is when you require that a customer completes some action, right? So CTAs is basically looking at what percentage of your customers completed that action. Complete an action might be, for example, to sign in or to sign up for something. It might be to provide some information. It might be to put something in the cart. It might be to complete a sale. You can define this action in different ways, right? And the percentage is going to be associated with, how good of a job have you done. Typically, this will be in the decision stage, right? And it's probably one of the best metrics for that, right? And leads nurture, this is how you're pushing people through the funnel. So you will be moving along this line somewhere. I guess you could also try to convince people to be your advocate. So it's some sort of movement typically between these 3 decision points, right? Or stages. Achieving new leads, it will be feeding people into the funnel essentially, and because they are new leads, right? You're probably in the early stages. And then cost per acquisition. Okay, so as you can see, there are many metrics that you can consider, and there are more that we have already mentioned that are not necessarily all in here. So the key question is, which ones should we use? Okay. And the answer to that question is your key performance indicators are the metrics that you should seriously look at. So from all that list of metrics, you're going to have to pick the ones that you think are going to be the best indicators at capturing whether you did achieve an objective that you had set forth or not. Okay, so again, we're going to take a customer-centric view, and we're going to start with an objective, right? And based on that objective, which is going to be somewhere around that customer journey, we are just going to try to map it to the metrics that we think are going to do the best job at capturing that. So here I have a couple of examples for you so that you can see, because these KPIs are going to be unique to firms that are in different industries, and it also depends on what it is that you're trying to achieve, right? So these KPIs, there is no such thing as a good KPI versus a bad KPI. KPIs are actually good or bad depending on what objective you're trying to achieve, right? And objectives should be set based on this customer journey that I was mentioning, right? So based on that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk you through a couple of examples just so that you can see how I will go about doing this, right? The first one is, let's assume, for example, that I'm trying to increase the awareness of my site. Maybe because, I'm a new brand and my customers, or my potential customers, I guess at this point, still don't know about me, right? And I think that, having a good website that has a high amount of traffic will be a good way of achieving this objective, right? So if this is my objective, what I'm going to do, okay, which is increase the awareness of the site, what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to find KPIs that actually will be indicative of that increase in awareness. For example, one thing that I could do is look at the increasing, let's say that I start at 0, increase the number of page views, right? So right now there's nobody seeing the site. If we can move it from nobody to maybe 1,000 views a month, right? That will be a good start. Now I'm going to talk about how you set the target, which is that specific number, in a couple of slides. Okay, we'll get there. But that will be one possibility. Now, for this same goal, okay, you can actually use a different metric. So instead of looking at the number of page views, you might consider just looking at the number of new users. I will argue, if you are interested in measuring awareness, right, which is what we have set as our goal, I think new user count is actually more relevant than number of page views, because it could be that a lot of the views come from old customers, or in our case, old visitors, right? So if you have the same person seeing many pages, it's not the same as many new people that are coming to our website, right? So if we're interested in awareness, what we're trying to do is work on trying to bring new people into the fold, and to do that, maybe new user count is a more relevant or more valid, I guess if you take a psychometric approach, metric to really verify whether the goal that you had set forth is actually being fulfilled or not. Okay, that will be one example. What about taking a different goal? Let's see if I want to increase the engagement with the brand, right? If that's my goal, then I could use different metrics for that, right? So, for example, I could try as a KPI for this new goal to increase basically the number of comments, right? So one way in which customers could engage with me will be just maintaining a conversation through whatever social media platform or website I'm present in, right? So that will be one type of looking at engagement. Another one will be looking at the number of times that they share my, for example, social media information, right? So those two will be two different metrics, or KPIs in this case, that I can use to determine whether my customers are engaging with my brand more or maybe less than they were before, right? And we can go through this exercise with any number of goals. So the goal is what's going to determine what kind of KPIs you could and should use. And in my experience, you should use a couple of KPIs. It is possible that one doesn't fully capture the phenomenon. And even if all of them are noisy, meaning that they are not perfect measures, when you have multiple measures, by getting some sort of average or some sort of function of both metrics, maybe a weighted average, and it's going to give you a more reasonable assessment of what's happening instead of only working with one metric. Now, like I was alluding to before, I've talked about goals in a little bit vague way. I say increase. That's not the way you want to set up the goals. The way you want to set up the goals is determine exactly what that increase is going to be. So I want to increase my web traffic, let's say, by 1,000 views a day. Okay, there's a very concrete metric. So how do you pick that 1,000 views per day, right? Well, typically what you're going to do is you're going to try to balance two things when it comes down to setting those targets. Okay, number one is you want to make sure that what you select as a goal is actually going to be achievable. Why? Because if you're a new, let's say you have a new website and nobody knows you, right? If you decide that you want to have 10,000 views a day as your goal, you're going to be demoralized really quickly, because it might take a long time until you can convince users that actually your site it's good enough to have 10,000 visitors a day, right? So it is very important that you're actually shooting for something that can be accomplished. Now, to determine what's achievable, one good starting point will be to look back at what has been happening in the past, right? So if this is not your first rodeo and you have a website and you know what the logs say that the number of visitors is per day, well, now you have a starting benchmark that you can use to determine what is a bump that will be achievable for you. Okay, good. That's one. Number two, what else are you balancing? If you set the goal too low, and that's not going to be motivational. That's not going to push you to do better. Okay, so you want something that is achievable, because if it's not achievable, you're going to get demoralized and you're going to stop trying. On the other hand, you want something that is going to stretch you a little bit, right? So if you think that you can easily get 100 people a day to come to your site, maybe instead of 100 you should shoot for 200, right? What you're doing is you're pushing yourself. You're not sure you can get there, maybe, right? But it's not a crazy idea that you think it's impossible to achieve. So you're trying to strike a balance between those two forces, okay? And to do so, it's always useful, like I was saying, if you have some past information. And if you don't, you can sometimes look at your competitors and see what they are doing, and based on that, set up your goals. Now, finally, how do you know if you have achieved any of these? You're going to have to track. So now you have set your goals, you have set your metrics, you have decided out of all those metrics which ones are you going to follow up closely. We're going to call those KPIs. Now you have set targets for those KPIs. So you have SMART goal, right? That it's measurable, hopefully achievable, but definitely that you have a clear target for, and also put a date on it. I forgot to mention that last slide. And then finally, you're going to have to use some tools to track these metrics so that you can actually have real data, right? And these are going to be mostly platform dependent, right? So for example, if you are using Google, you should look into Google Analytics. So here you have, for example, just a screenshot of typical, and there's many more types of data that is given to you through Google Analytics. But this is just so that you can have at least a sense for how it looks like. By the way, they have phenomenal user interface, so it's a great company if you're interested in looking at software development, right? So they know what they're doing. It's fairly easy to use. There is a lot of metrics, so if you are quantitatively inclined, you can really do a lot with a lot of this analytics platform. And for the most part, these are actually free to use. There are other platforms that, or other analytics software that you can use for which you need to pay, but at a starting point, I strongly suggest that you actually look at this. There are other tools that enable you to aggregate all this data and maybe look at it from one software perspective, but that's beyond the scope of this class. Okay, so what kind of information is in here? Well, all the metrics, or almost all the metrics that I've mentioned in the previous slide, you can actually have access through most of these platforms, most of these tools, right? So if you look at right here, what you can see is, you can see, for example, the people that are showing up at your site. Okay, this is for a specific page of a specific site, and you can see not only how many people are coming, right? So you can see the number of sessions here, or the number of page views, right? And you can also see, maybe more interestingly, where these people are coming from, right? So you can see how many of them are coming from organic search. That means that, you know, somebody typed in a search engine and then they click in your link and they ended up in your page, right? So as you can see, in this case, is the large majority, right? What percentage is it? It's like 59% or something like that, right? And then you have social. That means using some social media platform, they ended up in your site. And then direct, meaning that they type in directly the name of your website, right? And then finally referral, with some partner that actually refer them to our site, right? So, and as you can imagine, there are endless amount of metrics that you can look at through here. So what these tools are going to enable you to do is basically keep tabs on what your metrics are, so that you can decide whether you are meeting your goals or not.